So as I was saying, we can also think of this marginal rate of substitution a bit differently. We can sort of think of it as like willingness to pay. As the marginal willingness to pay. So in this sense, the consumer is willing to pay sum of good 1 to get sum of good 2. So consumer is willing to pay sum of good 1 in order to buy sum of good 2, or buy more of good 2. And if you start to think about, good 2 as a numeraire good, this kind of clears up some of maybe that interpretation, right? So if good 2, I meant composite good. If good 2 is a composite good, meaning it represents kind of every other good, and x1 is one particular good, or composite is like all the other goods, then the MRS of good 2 for good 1 is how many dollars the consumer is willing to give up or willing to pay on other goods. Willing to give up the amount is how many dollars the consumer is willing to give up on spending on other goods to consume more of good 1. So that's another way of thinking about the marginal rate of substitution. You can start to think about it in terms of willingness to pay, the marginal willingness to pay. And so the MRS is, you have good 2 is the numeraire good, and good 1 is whatever good we're interested in. Again, sorry, composite good, not numeraire, composite good. Numeraire is about relative terms. Composite is, like putting them all these other goods and representing it with X, good 2. So if good 2 is a composite good, so it represents all the other goods except for good 1, then the MRS is how much of good 2 for good 1. An MRS of good 2 for good 1 is how many dollars the consumer is willing to give up spending on other goods to purchase more of good 1. Hopefully that kind of makes sense as I stumble my way through that. I mean, the key thing is it has to be marginal. Marginal change, small change. So we do need small changes. We are talking about really small changes. And when we say willing, not necessarily how much you actually do have to pay. You actually pay, that's determined by prices. Just how much you would be willing to. So we can think about what the marginal rate of substitution is for these different examples of preferences that we looked at before. So if you remember with perfect substitutes, so let's just say perfect sub, there's a constant marginal rate of substitution. Right? We have those straight lines, so the slope of the indifference curves were constant. For perfect complements, the slope was either 0 or it was infinite. That's supposed to be my infinity sign. I know it's not the greatest, but it's either 0 or infinity, right? Because we had those like right angle indifference curves. For neutrals, it was infinity as well. Because they were, remember we had those anchovies and pepperoni, and you were indifferent towards anchovies, you were neutral towards anchovies. We had like a perfectly straight line indifference curves that kind of increase as we move to the side. So monotonicity implies a negative slope, as we talked about before. Which means we always have to give up some of good 2 to get some of good 1, and vice versa. Good 2 to get more of good 1. Or like, decreasing the amount of good 2 and increasing the amount of good 1 is the only way to get indifferent, along that same indifference curves. If they're convex, if the indifference curves are convex, then the marginal rate of substitution is falling as we increase x1. We should call that diminishing marginal utility, or diminishing marginal substitution. We can think about this classic kind of convex shape that we've been kind of drawing out. The slope is changing at different points. As we increase x1, notice that the slope is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So that's the idea here. So we have diminishing marginal substitution as we start to consume more and more of good 1. All right, so that's our look at chapter 3, which is about preferences. The next chapter, we're going to talk about utility, and we're going to do a little bit of calculus, and we're going to start calculating, the marginal rate of substitution for kind of different cases.